All right. Move over ACC. Duke, UNC, Gonzaga, Big Ten, SEC. I don't care. The Big 12 is the best conference in college basketball. It's not even close. This is Locked On Baylor.
You are Locked On Baylor, your daily podcast on the Baylor Bears, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Happy Wednesday and Baylor basketball game day, everybody. Drake Toll here from Sports Illustrated's Inside the Bears, along with Isaac Shade of Locked On College Basketball. Thank you for making Locked On Baylor your first listen every single day. And Isaac, I want to start the show by apologizing for name dropping UNC in there in the intro, because Isaac, to pull the shades back, also hosts Locked On Tar Heels. But this is a Big 12 conference that, even with Baylor not being the juggernaut we expected early on, a Big 12 conference that is the premier league in college basketball.
100%, Drake. Also, thank you for that little pun of pulling the shades back. I very much appreciate that. And listen, you got to throw a little shade at me as the host of Locked On Tar Heels after last year's NCAA tournament. I know still is, wow, that game was, I was in the building for that one, and it was one of the, that was a more insane environment than the Final Four game against Duke. So if I can just put it that way, that was wacky. Anyway, to your point, 100%. Not close, without question. The Big 12 is the best basketball conference in the nation right now, followed by the Big 10 second. And as you said, it's not remotely close right now. And so that is going to be, as we'll talk about, both a great thing for Baylor because of opportunities, but also a frustrating thing for Baylor because of some other opportunities.
Isaac, we've been knowing, as we say on Locked On Baylor, the Big 12 is a great conference. In the last few years of basketball, it feels like more and more national media outlets are giving the Big 12 its due notoriety, and no different this year. It feels like everything's really exploded on the scene with possibly 10 teams that have a case for an NCAA tournament bid. And you've already mentioned how that puts Baylor in a really tough spot because the league, as competitive as ever, could see its champion with 5 or 6 losses in conference play.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the thing. As you look at KenPom, for those who aren't aware, KenPom is one of the preeminent predictive basketball.
For the Baylor fans, the Bible of college basketball.
Yes, that's a great way to put it. And so this is what we rely on even more than the AP poll in the basketball world. And so right now, all 10 Big 12 teams are ranked in the top 45 at KenPom. And for those who aren't aware, there are 363 teams in Division I college basketball, and all 10 of these are top 45. And so as you're looking at these opportunities for the Bears and really all 10 teams in the league, you've got massive opportunities in front of you. I was checking out Baylor's schedule earlier. There's 18 games left, including this one tonight against TCU. And of those 18, literally all of them are quad 1 or quad 2, which is the games the NCAA selection committee is looking at in terms of who did you play? How strong are they? All of that. 14 of those 18 are quad 1 games, the most valuable games you can play in college basketball. You contrast that, like you were talking about the ACC in the cold open there, Drake, and let's contrast it with Duke, for example. The Blue Devils have 17 games left on their schedule. Only 6 of those are quad 1. So for Baylor, massive opportunities. You got great chances to go win some big games, but it also means, you're probably going to take some losses. And so, but the good news even in that is it's impossible to take a bad loss the rest of the season. It's just about how many of them pile up.
I love it. It's all right. Yeah, Baylor lost a lot of games, but they also, of their 10 losses, they were all 10 quad 1.
Legit.
Could end up being the case. And that's a good fallback for Baylor fans, although that's not what any Baylor fan 2 years removed from a national championship wants to point to is look at our quality losses. But it's going to become a case for the 7 through 10 teams in the Big 12, because at least 6 are squarely going to make it in from this league, likely more. Baylor hopefully being one of them, but you've seen some recent struggles, and in a league where it's tough to pick it up, come back and get a couple straight wins against such tough competition, I'm curious, Isaac, why the Big 12? The ACC, your Dukes, your UNCs, these NIL deals and the big names are there. In the Big Ten, you've got your NIL deals and the big names. The Pac-12's got some flashy programs.
Sure.
Why is it that these grassroots random teams from Kansas and Iowa are good at basketball?
Well, part of it is like from a league-wide standpoint, part of it is that the smallness of the number of teams. When you've only got these 10 teams and all of them are at least like good to strong, there aren't any bottom feeders there. And I know the Big 12 will have some from time to time, but like the ACC, for example, for a long time when they had 9 teams, that was the preeminent basketball league in the nation year after year after year. And then they added those Big East teams several years ago. And now you've got some perennial bottom feeders in Boston College. As to why some of these middle of the country teams are so good, you look at it and there's a lot of basketball history with Kansas. Dr. James Naismith started this game, right? You look at Texas, it's some of the best basketball talent in our entire nation, and that filters out through the rest of the conference. But when 2/5 of the conference's schools are in that one state, man, they're trying to divide it up. And obviously a couple of those are going to leak north to Oklahoma or over to Kansas and some things like that. And even at West Virginia, that is, I know that's further out on the geographical footprint for the conference, but man, Bob Huggins is there, one of the greatest college basketball coaches of all time. West Virginia itself has great basketball tradition even before him. And so you just, it's interesting. And even like you think about Oklahoma State, which isn't like a sexy, great thing, but man, their history with Hank Iba and things like that. And so the Big 12, it just, I think because it's the breadbasket of where college basketball started with Dr. Naismith, and then it just kind of leaks out from there a little bit.
Isaac, no nights off. That's what Fran Fraschilla has given. That's the moniker for the Big 12. In the Pac-12, you get Cal at some point, man, and that is just it's hilarious.
Hey, they got their second win this weekend.
Yes, they did. Ooh, in a conference win too, which is wild. You have teams in the ACC that are like Florida State, the Boston colleges are facing the same thing. Yeah, in the SEC, you've got your Vanderbilts that you're still scratching your head. And in the Big 12, you just don't get that. But I've always posed the question. I want to get your thoughts on whether or not, when it comes to NCAA tournament, March Madness, conference tournament, if that's a good or a bad thing, because these teams are being beaten up.
Yeah, absolutely. I think overall it's a good thing as long as you're not beaten up too much. Like for me, it's tougher in the Big 10 because there are 14 of them. There are a couple bottom feeders, but it's still got a lot of similar depth to the Big 12. And that brand of basketball is just even more kind of brutal than is the Big 12. And so I think for all these 10 universities, it's all about having some depth on your team. Like, for example, with Baylor, man, you've just got this whole cavalcade of dynamic guards that you love. And so, for example, in a game like this against Ohio State, where LJ Cryer's out, you got other dudes that can step in and step up to the plate. And that's necessary for Scott Drew to be able to have. And so I think long term, as long as you can stay relatively healthy, being that level of battle tested is infinitely better than, say, example, you mentioned Gonzaga earlier, being up in the West Coast Conference. They're like basically all of January, February, and early March, they're not playing anybody outside of maybe St. Mary's when they're good like they are this year, and BYU before they transfer conferences as well. And so I think it's a net positive, but you just got to stay away from major injuries like Jonathan Chama-Chachua, for example, unfortunately last year.
Yeah, it's a great point. And I want to cover a base for you because I think there are some Baylor fans that would listen and hear you say the Big Ten's a more physical brand of basketball. I think it is. You look at your Purdue's, who is year in and year out, has like 17 7-foot guys. Their point guard's 7'3", and you're like, all right, that's just Purdue basketball and Matt Painter. And you go to Iowa and Luka Garza. The way they play is certainly more physical. I think that's not even to talk about defense, too. I think the Big 12 plays such good defense, but you're exactly right there. And that's a great point. Other conferences are also dealing with the ins and outs and the beating you take over the course of 35 to 40 games. But to hone in on what's been going on and will continue to happen for Baylor basketball, looking back at Iowa State and forward to TCU, Isaac, I want to get first your thoughts on that game in Ames. But before we go there, I'm going to one of my favorite places in America, and that is I'm just kidding. It is LinkedIn Talent Solutions. I actually legally changed my middle name recently to LinkedIn Talent Solutions. It's long, it is convoluted, but it is something that fits me so well because LinkedIn Talent Solutions, LinkedIn's how I found most of my jobs. All the jobs that I do is LinkedIn. And you go right now, you're like, all right, I need that. There's like, I need that guy. I need some college kid energy. I need something like that with my company. LinkedIn's the place to go. LinkedIn Talent Solutions, purple hashtag hiring frame, and you will hire everybody. They're like, all right, look, we'll set you up with screening questions. You go in, you put in what those questions are. It narrows down the talent pool, and you make a hire from there. Small businesses rated number one when it comes to new hires. LinkedIn Talent Solutions is where you should go to bring the perfect fit to your staff. So right now, go to linkedin.com/lockedoncollege, linkedin.com/lockedoncollege to post your job for free. Keep in mind, terms and conditions do apply. Isaac. Oh, Isaac. Baylor, Iowa State, man. I'm looking around the rest of the Big 12 thinking, all right, Baylor's going to lose today because by then you kind of could tell the score. But luckily, Kansas is down 15. They're going to lose. Texas is going to lose to OU. This is looking fine. Baylor's not the only team to get upset. And then every other favorite climbed their way back to win the game, except for the Bears, who completely fell apart late in the second half. Is that like... You got to win them at some point, and if you're losing to an unranked Iowa State team, not the best sign in starting conference play.
Yes. Well, if I can put some relief on that part of it, I mean, anytime you're missing LJ Cryer, and I know that doesn't make up probably 15 points in this game, but that is a massive loss for this team, obviously, as Baylor dealt with most of last season. But here's the thing. Iowa State is a really good basketball team when Caleb Grill and Gabe Kalsher are on. And unfortunately, that has not been consistent this year, unfortunately for Iowa State. And unfortunately for Baylor, it both came together in the same game for this one. And I know that's frustrating, but it's going to happen sometimes. These two dudes combined to shoot 12 of 22 from the field, 10 of 18 from three, and 41 points. And that, I know that's a frustrating thing, especially when they're two guards, and Baylor prides itself on that backcourt defense, right? And so you look at that, and I know there's some frustration to it, but again, that's what's going to happen in the Big 12, especially as you get out on the road and head to Ames as they did. And so it's one of those things where I often say, listen, you throw it away. It's New Year's weekend, better days are ahead for Baylor. And I fully believe that. And so it's one of those where it's like, yes, you take the tape, you figure out why are we falling apart a little bit down the stretch here? How do we fix that and move forward the rest of the way in the conference slate?
This is tough. And I'm kind of setting you up for failure here, Isaac. Ta-da! Just to warn you. I should be able to answer this better, but Jerome Tang leaving Baylor, and I really want to give it to you in any capacity. If a coach like that leaves a program, what kind of hit can that leave? And do you think we're already seeing that with Baylor? Because he's having a lot of success, and Baylor's kind of treading water a little bit.
I think it does hurt, especially a long tenured assistant right there. Like a lot of times people are only paying attention to the head coaches. And so maybe it's like, you just lose one of your assistants. But like, that's a massive deal, especially someone like him that Coach Drew entrusts so much. And especially when it is an intra-conference move, as he went on to the Little Apple there in Manhattan, Jerome Tang. And so that certainly hurts, but you've got other long-tenured assistants who slide over into some of those seats, like Coach Alvin Brooks, for example, who just with his long history of coaching tradition, even in his own family. And so there's a lot of great stuff there. I think it does hurt some initially, but I don't think it hurts to the level that we want to say like, hey, we can blame some of what's happening this year on that. I think for me, the issues are more about the lack of the strength of front court that Baylor's had the last several years. That's to me the biggest glaring issue right now, is that Flo Thamba, who is a national champion and played a big role on that 2021 national championship team, just isn't Jonathan Chama-Chachua. He's not Jeremy Sohan. He's not, some of these other guys that have just been Maceo Teague, some of these other guys that have just been so massive in the front court for the Bears. He's not quite to that level. And so I think for me, until he gets back, and it sounds like he's on good schedule. It's just, man, what is it going to look like when he comes back? How ready will he be to go? We'll just have to wait and see on that. But it's just Flo Thamba, Jalen Bridges, they're not that dominant. And so even though you've got Flagler and Cryer and the super stud freshman and Keontae George, you need that front court to kind of balance it out a little more.
Yeah, Scott Drew in front court are two words that have not, or is it Scott Drew front court? There are a lot of words there, and none of them really have gone together over the course of his tenure here. I'm thinking about some of the best bigs he's had even in the last 5 years or so. Freddie Gillespie being one of them at 6'8". Like when your center is 6'8", when Azubuike came to town, that was a big problem for Baylor. And this year you've seen them be out rebounded by a lot of different teams. And the weird part about the Iowa State game was Baylor actually led the rebounding 32-30. Big part of that was because Iowa State made not almost, but a lot of their shots. And Baylor had more opportunities for offensive boards. But Isaac, this is an Iowa State team that Baylor didn't play very good defense against. They still didn't rebound that well against, although they did lead the category. And an Iowa State team that also got the best of North Carolina. So you've gotten to see them a little bit too. Yeah. Right. Is this just a really good Iowa State team? I know you've alluded to it a little bit, but give me some more comfort there.
Yeah, absolutely it is. The funny thing was I talked about when there's games when Caleb Grill goes off, you might be in trouble. Well, that was another example.
You've seen that before?
I've seen that firsthand myself. Yeah. So absolutely. Iowa State is a very solid basketball team. We talked about KenPom earlier. Right now, they're 41st at KenPom. And so, for the Big 12, that's low. But relatively speaking, compared to other conferences, that's like they're probably second or third in most of the other Power 5 conferences right now. And so, yeah, I say folks in Waco, take comfort. And just, again, as we had talked about earlier, you're just going to suffer some road losses in Big 12 play this year. You just got to come to grips with it.
Yeah, it's an Iowa State team that, again, has beaten North Carolina, but also lost by 20 to teams like Iowa and to UConn. You can't really tell what you're going to get night in and night out from them. And make the same case for a lot of really good basketball teams across the country. We've seen Gonzaga get blown out. We've seen Baylor and North Carolina get blown out. And Isaac, I don't want to keep piling this on.
Do it. Pile on.
I think Baylor fans are at least happy that they're not in UNC's boat, though UNC has plenty of... Right, or Kentucky. And I think both teams have plenty of talent to make late season runs.
Right.
It's just a matter of those juggernauts that are waiting in the 15 or below category to put it all together later in the year, like these experienced Purdue teams that you're seeing. And speaking of experience, Baylor gets that tonight with TCU, and they come to Waco. That's one of the bright spots with this is you get to come back home after a big blowout road loss, so a little more familiarity there. And familiarity with your opponent. A lot of these TCU guys from Eddie Lampkin and Mike Miles are guys that Baylor's seen before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of people wrote TCU off like right at the beginning of the season because they took that loss to Northwestern State.
They were bad. They were so bad.
It was a miserable game. And they only lost by a point. They shouldn't lose that game, but they only lost by a point. And other than that, they've won all of their other 12 games. And none of them, like I'm looking back at their schedule right now, there's nothing sexy. Their best win is a home win over Texas Tech on New Year's Eve, right? And so it's one of those teams that I don't really know what to do with yet. And I need to see more games like this one tonight to really get a better grasp on TCU, who we predicted preseason to be phenomenal. Mike Miles, even potentially preseason All-American. And I think we're starting to see that come into form again. And so this will be a really interesting game. I think it's massive for Baylor to get them at home. You talked about Eddie Lampkin. Like, you got to deal with him and make sure you're in good shape. Jamie Dixon is such a good basketball coach, and he will have the Horned Frogs ready to go, especially, man, just, this is weird to talk about it this way, but when you have just like what they're doing right now on the football field, like that kind of bleeds over that confidence into some of your other teams. I know maybe we don't think about the humanity of that, but that can give your other athletic teams on campus some confidence. And so I'm really curious to see how that factors in as well. But I feel good about Baylor winning this basketball game, especially because it's at home there in Waco.
I like the idea that success breeds success across programs, because these guys all eat in the same athlete dining hall. And when the tennis team, who just won a Big 12 championship, is sitting next to the women's basketball team, who just won a Big 12 championship, and the football team, who last year won the Sugar Bowl, you get a feeling of, okay, that's the standard where we are. Baylor gets that, but now TCU, to an even more extreme point, being in the national championship in football, gets that as well. And I do think they carry that chip on their shoulder, but boy, there's not a lot of on the court chips for the TCU shoulder. Barely beating Arkansas Pine Bluff earlier this year, sneaking by teams like Cal, struggling against squads like SMU. They really shouldn't. And then when you expect them, it's like, all right, you're ranked, so you should beat a Utah. You should beat a Texas Tech. They go out and they find a way, even in comeback fashion against Tech. This is a TCU team to me that is not a dominant basketball team, but it's a team that wins.
That's right. I completely agree with that assessment. No pushback, no difference. They have squeaked by. It feels like, to your point about some of those games you mentioned, I feel like at times kind of consistently throughout this season, they've played to their level of competition.
Yes.
And I think now there's going to be this oh crap, we're getting into Big 12 play now. We got to step it up and really find our way here. And so I expect them to compete and to compete well. It's probably one of those close games. I'd imagine it's within 4 in the closing couple minutes. And then, Flagler maybe takes over down the stretch, hits a key 3 and some free throws, and Baylor gets away with a 5 or 6 point victory.
You talk about Flagler, who had 18 in the first half against Iowa State. To complement his 18, Keontae George had 1. Fast forward to the second half, Flagler has 2. Keontae George has 15. Right. Exactly. It's completely flipped. and if LJ Cryer doesn't play in this game, then you're going to have both of those guys on at the same time, along with the complementary pieces like Jalen Bridges or Flo Thamba scoring down low. Josh Ojenwuna has shown flashes, and Caleb Lohner, and you could keep going with this roster and its depth. But what does it look like outsider perspective for you? What does it look like when Baylor does completely put this thing together?
Oh, it is one of the most frustrating teams to play against, because you have to be I think about we talked earlier about the second half of the round of 32 game last year in Fort Worth, where Carolina had one of the biggest leads in against the number 1 team. I was sitting there at my computer looking up biggest 8-over-1 upsets in March Madness history. And then here comes this massive comeback. Why? Because Scott Drew puts out these disruptive guards who can do anything they want to. And it's one of those things where in some ways they've put that fear in you before you even step on the court. And then when you have guys, and I know he's not there this year, but somebody like Jeremy Sohan who can just mess things up, mess around. Those are some of the bigs you think about with Baylor. And so from an outsider perspective, although I'm not completely outsider, I've got a bunch of family that graduated from Baylor. And so I've been a Baylor fan for a long time, actually. And so, it's fun to see kind of I'm tangentially connected. And so I love what a just disciplined and tough team they always are, game in and game out. I feel like Baylor's a team, clearly this game from last year that we've been talking about multiple times is literally never out of a game, because that pressure, that ball hawking can always keep them in a game. And that said, though, I know the defense hasn't been as strong this year. And so that's something I will be watching closely in Big 12 play is Baylor's offense right now is kind of outpacing the defense in terms of efficiency. Can that defense get back to the level we're used to seeing from the Bears?
Yeah, you're not used to the whole offense being better than the defense with the Scott Drew Baylor team at all.
Right.
And even, in the last couple of years, I remember holding Texas under 50 and Villanova under 50. And hey, Baylor will score 59 points, but you're holding somebody else to 44 and you get out of Waco with a win. That's not the brand of this team, which is odd to see that culture shift, that defensive culture shift. I love that you're alluding to this game, that round of 32 game. Scratching and racking my brain of all the athletic events I've ever been to. I've never seen anything like that. A 25-point last 12 minutes comeback for a really fraudulent 1-seed Baylor team. I'll say it. They didn't have very much depth. Kendall Brown was not good by the end of the year, to the point where he only played 22 minutes in an overtime game. But that game itself was just nuts. Thank you for giving me that memory because of how great it was.
It was fun.
Despite the loss, and UNC obviously goes on a tear. But before we get you out of here, Isaac, I'll pitch a couple things to you, kind of a 2-minute drill. Done. Keontae George, go.
Keontae George, I thought coming into the year would be the freshman of the year. He has been solid. He's not, I think it's not that he's done anything wrong. It's just that there's some others like Brandon Miller down at Alabama who has just been stupid good, like kind of on the Jabari Smith level of last year. Although for me, a better 3-point shooter than Jabari Smith was. And so there've just been a couple of other freshmen that have really popped, but I love how like solid he's been. One of the things that I think is super crazy helpful for him is he comes into this vaunted 3-guard Baylor lineup alongside 2 veterans in Cryer and in Flagler. Like, I think that's massively important for his development, and it helps keep him consistent. Like, I'm looking through his stats right now, only 2 games in under double-digit scoring. I'd like to see his 3-point percentage get up a little bit higher. He's shooting 33.7%, like maybe up to 35, but like for a freshman in the Big 12, I love that. And so he is somebody, he's one of those, for me, kind of appointment viewing. I want to watch Keontae George every time he steps out on the court. He's going to be somebody that the NBA covets in a big way. And again, love him just as part of this long history of Scott Baylor and stud guards.
Yeah, he's got the takeover card at any point in the game where it's all right, this is Keontae George's time. He's not great from deep. Honestly, his shooting numbers aren't great whatsoever, but he's played pretty solid complementary basketball, even on nights where he's not shooting very well, which has worked really well to Baylor's favor. I'll give you a couple more of these names here in the 2-minute drill. LJ Cryer.
Yes, man, it's just, you hate it for a guy who's out right now, you know, with these concussion symptoms, who had missed so much of last year. Like, I never want to see these young men like struggling to get back into the game. And so hopefully, you know, for this game tonight against TCU, he will be ready to go. But again, just having that veteran thing, being a Texas kid from Katy, I love it. He is somebody, man, to see. You just talked about Keontae George not being a great shooter. For a guard to be shooting over 50% for the season, and man, I know he doesn't get to the line very often, but shooting over 90% from the free throw line, he's just somebody you can trust in, believe in, and be an extension of the coaching staff. And that is a young man you want on your team any time of day.
Isaac, last one for you, and it's not Adam Flagler, because that one speaks for itself at this point. We know. This one, I'm going to give a stipulation. I want to know your thoughts on him, except for on April 5th, 2021. Take that game out of the notebook, because it's the greatest game he has ever and will ever play, but Flo Thamba.
Flo Thamba. Well, I kind of alluded to it a little bit earlier, like, he's somebody you love, that he's been around in this program. Now this is his 5th year, a national champion. Like, there is something to be said for this entire roster that has been, or anyone that's been around for a couple of years, and how that spills over to players that come in later. Like, there's just something about that winning culture. I mean, if you put back the COVID season, Baylor's basically a number 1 seed the past 3 seasons. Like, they would have absolutely been that in that COVID year. And so while, you know, he is not Chachua, like, he is a 6'10" big, every ounce of that. And when you have seen, as you alluded to, that one just special, fantastic game, like, if I remember correctly, he's not scored in double digits this entire season. I think he's hit 8 several times. I can look it up quickly while I'm talking. No, he's hit 8 one time against Washington State. Everything, like, that's his highest point scoring of this entire season. But and he's only hit double-digit rebounds once as well. And so it's weird for someone of his size. That's what's always stuck out to me, is like, he is a solid college basketball player, but he just doesn't get big numbers. And it's confounded me always, because he should. And so, as you said, you take away, it's like in class in school, when it's like you've got this one grade that's really high and it brings your average way up. You take that out and it's like, oh, okay, well, you're an okay student, right? Like, I feel like that is Flo Thamba to me as a college basketball player.
Yeah, you take out April 5th of 21, we got a different story. We got some nuts stories. He also, it's weird to me as I see these guys, you mentioned 5th year guy. Like, Flotham has been on Baylor's campus longer than I have. Like I'm a senior at this point, and it's like I can't imagine this guy's been around for a while. He's the wise old sage. Adam Flagler, LJ Cryer, it feels like the rest of these guys have been here, and they have. But I don't know, Isaac, man, if this team can put it together, they've got a lot of great potential. They've been a 1 seed the last 3 years, like you said, and they've got the potential to do that, but they are looking down the barrel of teams like Kentucky and UNC that feel the same way, that the potential's there. It just hasn't come together yet.
I think you're absolutely right. This is a team. I think back to when Florida repeated as national champions in the mid 2000s. That second team was really good, but it felt like they kind of floated through a lot of the regular season. And I'm not saying that's what Baylor's doing, but it's like they knew they just needed to get to March, and then they had the experience, that winning tradition to do what they needed to do. There's just something like for Baylor, it's like you just need to get to March, and then you're ready to go. Like I don't care what the numbers beside these teams' name are. When Baylor steps onto the court in an NCAA tournament scenario, I trust them. Why? Because they've been there before. They know how to do it, and they're winners. They're hungry to make up for what happened last year in the NCAA tournament. And I am a believer in what Baylor can do down the stretch, regardless of what the record is in Big 12 play.
Isaac, thank you. I kept you long, like 8 minutes ago. I was like, oh yeah, this is the last thing. And I lied to you. Thanks so much for coming on the show today. Where can those who now have learned that you're a secret Baylor fan find your stuff?
Yes, you can find my personal stuff on Twitter is where I'm most active, at Isaac Shade. 1 S, 2 A's in Isaac, and Shade has a C in it. It's a German word that means what a pity. I don't know. Anyway, and then you can obviously, as Drake said earlier, find me on Locked On College Basketball. Myself and Andy Patton are the co-hosts of that. 5 days a week, college basketball content. And then if you ever want to check out the Tar Heels for any weird reason, you can find me there as well.
I love it. Isaac, thanks so much again for coming on the show. For everybody listening, tomorrow, recap episode of TCU. For those that are watching, that over there is a case of Diet Dr. Pepper, which I'll drink in 48 hours on top of a suitcase. I'm supposed to fly to Seattle at some point in my life. I don't know when it's going to happen. So if there's not a recap episode tomorrow, that suitcase is why. We'll see what we get. No matter what. Thank you for making Locked On Baylor your first listen every single day. Come back tomorrow, or don't, if there's one. This has been, always will be, Locked On Baylor.